this is one big book, isn't it? However, I don't have to look too hard at it, and I see that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. So maybe it's two books, right? But then again, I don't have to look that much further, and I see that we have a table of contents, and in the table of contents, it refers to 66 books. 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. So is this one book? Is this one story? Or is this just a lot of disconnected stories that's talking about the same God? Some assumptions that we're going to have as we look at the Bible is first that this is one unified book with one unified story, and this will affect how we look at all the individual stories. Also, we're going to assume that the Bible is always making progress. Now, that's a little bit harder to see because some of the stories in the Bible are really hard. However, when we get to Act 1, Scene 3, Step 3, we will really begin to see that God is always making progress, even when the stories are difficult. Now, I just mentioned something you're probably not very familiar with, and that is Act 1, Scene 3, Step 3. We have an outline here that I've learned that helps me connect all the stories into the big story that God is telling us. I'm going to want you to get familiar with it so that you can see where we are in the story and how the individual stories connect to the bigger story. And then it'll be easier for you to see that God is in fact always making progress, even if at times the stories are very difficult. Now, beginning with this story, you'll notice at the very top, we have something that's called a prologue. And there's actually a prologue in the Bible, and I'll help you to see that in just a second. Prologue is simply a lot of information packed into a small period of space in order to catch you up to hear the story that's being told. And that actually happens in the Bible. In fact, Genesis 1 through 11 covers a time span of about 2,000 to 3,000 years. And then you stop at Genesis 12, and from Genesis 12 through Genesis 50, the time span only covers about 250 years. And so when you see that just in the first book of the Bible, you have to ask yourself, what's going on? It seems as if God is catching us up to the scene and the story that He's about to tell. And at Genesis 12, the story begins. So what is He catching us up to in Genesis 1 through 11? Genesis 1 through 11 can be viewed as a fence. For instance, cattle herders, as they're trying to keep all their cattle in one space, will build these fences. They'll do this is called a post hole theory when it comes to literature, and that is that they will slam a post into the ground, and not having all the materials to keep putting posts around to make a barrier, they'll connect the post with a cheaper material like barbed wire, and then put another post in the ground. And in so doing, with little material, they're able to cover a lot of ground. Well, the same happens in Genesis 1 through 11, in that we're covering almost 3,000 years of history, but we're only using a couple key posts to help us see what's happening during this large amount of history. So what are those posts? Well, it begins, obviously, as you know, boom, we put a post in the ground, and they tell the story, and that story at the beginning is creation. Now, within the story of creation, we quickly see Adam and Eve, and they sin, and they're separated from God. But then they go a little bit further, and they look at the story of Cain and Abel. And we see that the problem with sin that started with Adam and Eve was now also in their children. It didn't go away. It didn't just stick with Adam and Eve. And then we have a genealogy. The genealogy acts as the barbed wire that connects the posts together. And then the genealogy takes us to the next post. Boom! The story of Noah. And in the story of Noah, we see that even though people have multiplied and have filled the earth, sin is still a big and serious problem that requires big and serious solutions. And then at the end of the story of Noah, there's another smaller story that tells us that sin is still there, even after the flood. And so we have another genealogy connecting us to the next post. Boom! The Tower of Babel. And what does the Tower of Babel show us? Yet again, as people are multiplying and filling the earth, sin is a big, big problem then Genesis 12. God has already hinted at the solution back in Genesis 3, but Genesis 12, God begins to unfold his plan for how he's going to deal with this problem of sin. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're not going to look at Genesis 12 till next week. So you can look at these stories that I've mentioned, maybe you will in your classes, and you'll clearly see that there is a global devastating issue with sin. That's easy for me to help you see that in the Bible. But some of the bigger questions that I have that I want you to think about and maybe discuss in your classes is, will you own your part for bringing sin into the world? How does this reality affect how you interact with the world around you, knowing that sin is everywhere, in you and around you? Is there any hope? Or is the world helplessly stuck in this state? But remember, though the book is already written, the story is still being told, and we are in this story. Does God have an answer? Will we see it for what it is? Let's look at this big book together, and let's try and identify what that one story is, and what God is telling us through how he's worked through history, and how he's going to keep working through history through you guys.